Right, we're recording. Let's go.
Great, thanks. Welcome everybody to Office Hours number 15. We have some great topics to discuss this week, but just to kick off, we'll go straight into ETH Node Watch. There's not much to report on this week. There's no additional updates on dates or anything to do with the upcoming Ethereum upgrades. Still aiming for mid-July for deployment with the 4 EIPs, including 1559, which we're all anticipating. In terms of Node client updates, the only update I have tracked is the 3rd of May version of Aragon, which is what TurboGeth is now called. You can activate the trace features in Aragon with the storage mode HRTC flag when you're starting it up. Keep in mind that if you do that, you're going to need to, I believe you need to resync from scratch. It adds about 150 gigs to...
Jim, your microphone is going weird. I'm not sure if it's just me or for everyone else.
I hear it too.
Okay.
For me as well.
Same. Is it any better now?
No.
Nope.
No.
Can you check the port if maybe it got out a bit of the port or something?
Is XLR still a conquer now? How about now?
No,
Nope.
same.
Nope. Okay, just give me a minute. I'll just turn everything off and back on.
Yeah, I can take off the discussion from where you left it off. So in terms of like TurboGeth updates, they implemented trace filter support, and as far as Chris tested, it's a bit different from the Open Ethereum implementation with like different responses for different queries. Am I right in saying that, Chris?
Yeah, so I did a bunch of testing, basically diffing the responses from Open Ethereum trace calls versus Aragon with the storage mode HRTC flag. The trace filter RPC method seems perfectly fine. Like RPC responses seem to match, and I scan quite a large block range. The trace call method is showing some inconsistencies, so we're not 100% at prime time necessarily. I personally, before using Aragon for any critical workloads, I'm gonna, want to check over millions of recent blocks that every single RPC response is identical. But it's looking a hell of a lot better than it did even a few weeks or a couple of months ago. So we're on the right track.
I wonder, would it be a good idea to just have two graph nodes sync the same subgraph, preferably on the same server with like different Docker containers or something, and just diffing the tables of that specific subgraph to see whether or not there's any difference in the data ingested or something?
How's my mic now?
It's better now, yeah.
So in terms of testing, so myself and Chris were looking at the RPC test binary, which comes with Aragon. And this is what Chris was using to diff the outputs from Open Ethereum and TurboGeth, as far as I understand. So all of us can be doing that. If you have an Open Ethereum node with traces and you have a Aragon node that's traces enabled, you can run RPC tests across whatever range of blocks you want to, and it will give you an output and tell you where the differences are. So it might be useful if we agree on like a large group of blocks and we all start providing data around what diffs were found within that group of blocks. It might be helpful to Alexei. I know he was thrilled when Chris provided some feedback, so the more people that are providing feedback via that RP test tool, I think the greater the chance that we have more support from Alexei and the team in fixing this and making it making the dream come true for graph indexing on Aragon.
I just dropped the command that you can use to test quite a small block range, but I found transactions in that particular block range where there is a diff, and so the test fails. That particular binary, yeah, if you run make all, in the Aragon repo. It will build, the kind of core binaries, but also all of the test binaries, including RPC test. So do give it a bash, and at least this is how I'm going to be evaluating new Aragon releases as they roll out.
Yep, same here.
Sounds good.
That was everything I had in the client space. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up around nodes? Okay. So let's move on to, I guess, probably the most anticipated topic for today. We have Janice with us today. Welcome, Janice. And you may have seen that Martin just announced the 0.15 release of the indexer software for mainnet. So Janice is with us today to talk a bit about the changes and what we can expect as we deploy that software. Janice, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So heads up, I've got a pretty loud baby on my lap right now, so she may be a bit distracting from time to time. But my wife's getting a vaccination right now, so she can't look after her. I've posted a link to the latest release notes in the office hours chat. So if you want to follow along, I'll go through the changes and talk about them for a little bit. There's compared to, so the new version is 0.15, and compared to the last mainnet release, it's really not that much of a change, like on the surface at least. So that's some configuration. Yeah, okay. Well, you're really loud. There's really like two major changes compared to the last mainnet release. One is that we're introducing Scala on mainnet, and the other is that indexes are now able to index the network subgraph themselves rather than relying on this central gateway endpoint. Yeah. Okay. The first change you've already played with on the testnet. So there's a new collect receipts endpoint on the gateways that you can use to collect a number of receipts that are now allocation based as opposed to vector transfer based, which we also had on the testnet for a bit. That endpoint will convert a number of receipts into a so-called query fee voucher, which you can then submit on chain, similar to how you initially had, and I think in the last mainnet release still had the collect transaction. So that works very much the same way, except that you collect a voucher or redeem a voucher instead of collecting some query fees. Effect is the same, and ends up in the staking contract. Yeah, everything's good. And so that's new. You know that from the testnet already. It's set by an environment variable. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so the two changes that you really need to make to enable Scala on mainnet with this new release is you have to set the indexer agent collect receipts endpoint variable or flag to this new endpoint, and the details are, as always, in this in the network's documentation. So in those configuration tables, you'll have the value that you need to put in there. The other value that you need to also configure is the so-called client signer address. So that's the address that all receipts will be signed with, and so that allows the indexer service receipts that are incoming are valid from that client. In this case, all the gateways that we run will have the same client signer address. And so they can also, all the gateway instances can also collect the receipts, regardless of which gateway location they were created from. And sorry. This makes it so that you can only really handle receipts and vouchers from a single location. One sec. Okay. And that's obviously temporary measure until we have vector back, which we have integrated, and the code is still in the Indexa release, but it's not being used right now. But that'll make it, that'll remove that restriction again. So that's the only thing you need to do there. That will enable Scala, and the new gateway update will also roll out later today. And at that point, you'll receive queries that these new receipts. The second big change. Second big change is the network subgraph indexing. So you've all seen these errors like fail to query, active allocation, stuff like that. And that is now, or can be, a thing of the past. So basically what you can do now is you can index the network subgraph, click on it yourself, and you can and you can use the gateway endpoint as a fallback still. So you kind of get the best of both places. If the subgraph fails on your side or is not synced yet, the agent will use we'll still use the fallback, and once it's synced, or if it's synced and it's still healthy, then it'll use the local subgraph in your through your query or graph nodes. And the one change that's kind of optional here but makes sense is that you also configure your Indexa service to point to a new /network endpoint on the Indexa agent, because that'll basically proxy through the same fallback logic, and otherwise the Indexa service would have to hit the gateway directly, and that doesn't make sense if you index it yourself. You get faster round trip times, probably more reliable endpoints, so kind of makes sense. So for this, I'll be finished in a moment. So for this, the agent has a new server that's served from port 8002. You can rebind that with an environment variable or a syncing port flag, and that needs to be then exposed to the Indexa service. So the Indexa service will change its network subgraph endpoint from the gateway to this new Indexa agent port. Okay. That's really the main changes. Everything else is kind of internal, some database stuff, database models to keep track of the receipts and the vouchers and so on. Okay, I'll mute myself now.
Well done, Janice. Well done. The question I was going to ask you earlier before we started recording was actually, I think you've pretty much answered it, which is around the new feature of being able to get or sync the endpoint ourselves. So it sounds like we do need to define both. If we want to ultimately do that and sync it ourselves, so we can query it ourselves on our local agent, we should be defining both the original network subgraph deployment as the alternative, so it uses that until we finish syncing the new feature, so to speak.
Yes, and you can also skip the network endpoint, but then the Indexa agent will basically be down until the network subgraph is synced, and that can take a few hours. So
yeah,
wouldn't recommend that.
The other question I had was on the testnet. I personally had some issues around timings of the migration. So my services were starting before my agent was starting the migration process. If you remember, is that still something that could come up?
No, service no longer writes the models to the database, so it's all on the agent now. Service just uses them, and the service might crash if the models are not the way it expects them to be, but it should then normally, you set it up so it restarts. The agent is the only component that runs migrations and syncs the models now, so that problem should be gone now.
Excellent. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask Janice?
One from me. Hey, Yanis. Thanks for the update. So it looks like, the indexer agent is responsible for that failover logic to the publicly hosted network subgraph. And I guess just an observation is that I know a few indexers, or many of the ones that I've spoken to, don't necessarily run indexer agent all the time. And I think that largely comes down to just wanting to avoid any on-chain transactions. But it sounds like indexer agent now becomes, somewhat critical in the kind of operational flow. So yeah, does that make sense? And is there any reason that functionality was built into indexer agent as opposed to just directly into indexer service?
Yes, just to avoid code duplication, and just avoid doing the same things over and over again. Is not implemented yet, but it could allow to, for instance, only query everything once and then distribute the same data to all the indexer services. Just reducing the number of requests made, etc. I'm personally totally open to moving that kind of logic into a separate service that runs alongside the indexer services and the agent. But yeah, that would be next step.
Okay, and then just to confirm, moving forward, indexer agent, if we, use the local subgraph copy, needs to be online 24/7.
It doesn't. It's up to you. Depends on whether the service needs it for the network subgraph. You can of course configure the service to point to the gateway still. But yeah, if you need if you want to index the network subgraph data locally, for now you'll have to run the agent. It's a fair point. I didn't consider that when implementing the network subgraph indexing logic in the agent. That some people don't run the agent, so we can improve that. But for now, that will be the case if you want to index it yourself. Yes.
Cool. Thanks.
I have a dumb question. What if we sync the subgraph on a graph node and point the indexer service to that specific subgraph API?
You can. Yeah, good idea. Yep, totally.
Awesome.
Yeah. That basically answers the question, and yeah, then you don't need to run the agent yourself. You just point the indexer service to your local graph node.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Cool. Problem solved.
With obviously the caveat that until the network subgraph is fully synced, your indexer is pretty useless.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, you can still use the gateway, and then once it's synced, you can just switch it over and restart the service.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Anybody in the audience want to ask questions about the latest release?
If there are more questions on this, I'm happy to answer them on Discord later. I think I have to look after the baby now. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. Just one very quick one, Janice. You mentioned there that the gateways are yet to be upgraded. So do you have a timeline for when that happens?
Sometime tonight.
Tonight. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Janice. Appreciate your input today. We're all looking forward to the next stage of the migration.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Let's have a look at the agenda. So I guess that was our repo watch for today. Seb's not here. Is there any other PRs that people wanted to cover or that they noticed before we move on? Right, so the next stages, or the next in the agenda, is the usual This Week in Migration, just as a checkpoint as to where we are in the process. So I think really the detail of what Martin put in his announcement and what Janice has just given us around the latest indexer release and the timing for the gateway upgrade is pretty much the information that most people here are looking for. So once those gateways are upgraded, I guess we're very much into phase 2 proper, and should expect to see something in terms of queries from our migration partners. So I guess after this call, most of us indexers will be all on the warpath to upgrading to version 15. I know I certainly will be. Does anybody want to discuss anything else around that before we move on? Okay. I have a governance section here. I wanted to update everybody on where things are with the arbitration charter, what's been proposed so far. So Brandon, just to sort of review, Brandon joined us very briefly last week in order to talk a bit about the proposed arbitration charter. And there's been some feedback on the forum post from myself and Oliver and Konstantin from P2P around what's been proposed, and Brandon has taken some of that on board, and there's a few changes that have been made to the proposed charter, including the piece that I was sort of focusing in on, which was around our first of incident around enzyme and the subgraph fatal error. So what's been added to the charter in that regard for future similar incidents is that we should allow indexers to collect indexing rewards right after the subgraph fails. So what does that mean in practice? It means that you would submit a POI for the last good epoch, I guess, for that failed subgraph. And my hope is that might possibly feed into what Ford was proposing around closing subgraphs immediately once the failure has been detected. And I'm just wondering if it's more complex than just closing it, and maybe in that situation there's more work to be done in terms of coding. Ford, do you have any thoughts on that? And Ford is in the audience. Are you here with us today, Ford? You might be busy on something else.
He just raised his hand. I think he wants to speak.
No, that was me inviting him.
Okay.
Hey guys,
Ford.
yeah, I'm here.
Did you catch my?
So I caught the end of that, and I think I got the gist of it. I have an update in flight that will close an allocation as soon as the corresponding deployment fails. It's a pretty simple code change, and I expect that to, for the most part, remove that entire situation where you have like this zombie allocation that can no longer be closed. And so hopefully that alleviates that pain point for you guys. But I'm going to try to get that in onto mainnet this week, and then we can move from there and see if we need to add anything else around that.
Cool. I mean, I'm just thinking now about Chris kind of brought up an issue around the new features in the indexer stack, the 0.15 stack, whereby some indexers choose not to run their agent all the time. So I'm hoping really that it would have been nice to have Brandon on, but that this piece of the charter also covers indexers that decide not to run their agent all the time, and therefore wouldn't have the benefit of that feature kind of watching the chain all the time for them. If you read Brandon's response to my post on the arbitration proposal forum thread, that's the gist of what I get from it. So the indexer would be able to still submit a PO, maybe epochs later, the indexer would still be able to submit a POI, I guess, manually for the last good epoch that the subgraph was working in. Maybe that plays into, maybe when if they turn the agent on Ford, maybe the piece that you're talking about would address that even, anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, it'd be a little tricky to do so automatically. You'd want at least a confirmation from the indexer, because, presumably you could have a situation where you're in an epoch and the last valid POI is, 3, 5, 10 epochs ago, and the agent can't automatically close that allocation in the way that it would like to with a valid POI. So I think that situation is going to always require a little bit of hand-holding from the indexer. One feature that's in the backlog, I don't think it's high priority right now, but is additional support in the indexer CLI to manually close allocations and do some of this more low-level allocation management that right now you are probably doing through Remix or however you like to execute your transactions. You could have that, and then the flexibility in the arbitration charter would allow for these scenarios to take place.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on now with having to interact with Remix, I'm noticing a lot of questions coming up around that as well. So we've got some basic documentation already. I know that was pointed out to me today. It's there in the official docs. But I think there's a number of different situations as well that we need to cover off with documentation around, manual interaction with contracts.
Yeah, I think it should be priority to get some documentation around that stuff as soon as possible. And then in the medium term, I would love to move a lot of those interactions into like the Indexer CLI or applications that we control. So we can just really facilitate those interactions and make it easy for y'all.
Yeah, that would give great peace of mind, I think, for indexers. Okay, so I think that was everything I wanted to cover specifically on remediation for this first of Fatal Error event. But something I want to highlight again, I want to make sure that I'm sort of creating enough signal around this as I possibly can. This is just one event. And most indexers who have been, unluckily tied up in this event around the enzyme subgraph have lost indexer rewards. No query fees at this point because there's no query fees at that time, but certainly indexing rewards were lost because indexers had to submit an OXO POI. So I still have a lot of concern that events like this turn up, and there's no specific entity that is, to blame for that, but certain stakeholder groups are being punished financially because there's something that we haven't yet sort of picked up and remediated via code or via process. And my thought is that we need something in the arbitration charter that at least acknowledges that these situations are going to occur, but also considers whether or not compensation should be provided. Not sure how, not sure if it's practical at all, just thinking out loud. We're going to have more issues as we go along through migration that we don't, that we weren't ready for, we didn't expect. This is just the nature of huge projects, right? So how do we address that? Do we need to address this one that we had with the fatal error on the subgraphs? And how do we address potentially compensation further down the line? Chris, I know you have some strong thoughts on this. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, just throwing you in there as usual.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken a bit about this over the last week, and it's great to see that the arbitration charter and the proposals have taken account into, the feedback into account. I think, relating to this specific event, I do think that there needs to be uniform treatment. So I guess there are two things that come to mind. First is that we need to be careful with any event that is a first of, because it sets precedent for future events. Now, it sounds like the position that the arbitration charter is taking is that in the case of failed subgraphs, the last valid POI can be submitted, and rewards can be retained. I think that has some holes in it, because I could theoretically leave my allocation open for a longer period of time and claim rewards on work that doesn't exist because the subgraph failed. But that aside, we're in this somewhat awkward situation where the semi-official advice that was given to indexes was that they should be closing their allocations with 0 POIs and forfeiting indexing rewards. But now we're coming to a point where that position has changed and an allowance is being made, at least certainly for future events of this nature, where this situation would result in indexes retaining their indexing rewards. And that's a tricky situation, because we don't want to split the herd of indexes and have some that have, by virtue of following the advice given, forfeited those rewards, and others that kind of waited it out and based on the new advice that hasn't gone through yet but seems to be what the arbitration charter is indicating, retain those rewards. I think we need uniform treatment for indexes as a group, and that probably means compensating those indexes that did close with a 0 POI. Full disclosure, I was one of them. And then, yeah, I think, you know, what has already kind of been spoken about is just that indexes in particular sit at the forefront, you know, really, you know, in the trenches in terms of risks relating to first of events. You know, things going wrong for the first time in a way that hadn't really been considered or accounted for before. Yeah, the process that we use to evaluate the outcomes for those events needs to be flexible enough to make sure that indexes as a group are not penalized for being at the front line, because if they are penalized, that creates some concerning incentives. And yeah, I guess that's a slightly different topic. I'm gonna stop talking now and give it back to you, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I know where you're going with that. Obviously, we've talked about it, but it plays into the same theme, right? And I mean, you say indexers, but at the end of the day, everything, apart from I guess the curator award, which comes out before that, but everything that's impacting the indexer also impacts the delegator.
Totally. Yeah.
So this is not just, you know, about one stakeholder group. This is about all of them, really, when it comes down to the crunch. So does anyone else have thoughts on this they want to share? Alex, I know you had some strong opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, with this recent update in the arbitration charter, I think it solves half the problem, meaning that now indexers will be able to get some rewards on those failed subgraphs. But at the same time, the subgraph developers also have to pay a lot of money for migrating their subgraphs, especially if they have signal that's not theirs on those specific subgraphs, because they have to pay the 1.25% of the signal themselves in order to migrate it to the new version, if I recall correctly. And yeah, that's the rest of the problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so that, I mean, it all compounds the problem, right, doesn't it? Because now we're talking about real money. At every stage here, every action we want to take is involving real money at the at the end of the line. So I feel like there's a couple of things coming out of this, and they're already emerging. And one is more rigorous discussion around the first part, like what Chris was talking about, is really more rigorous discussion around the arbitration charter itself and how it deals with these things from the front end point of view. So, you know, the part where indexers are potentially losing rewards, and then that trickles to the other stakeholders. But then also the wider subject of subgraph management, right? And I know that Fubi is working on, I don't think he's posted it yet, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but he's working on sort of a statement on, you know, the state of subgraph management today and where we need to go. I know that Dave from Edge and Node has, you know, made some public comments around his thoughts on, you know, the expense of doing things like subgraph upgrades and how it's currently could be too expensive. So I think there's certainly two streams of activity here going on independently. The one I want to spend to focus myself on, and I think other indexers should as well, is the arbitration process and making sure that we cover off as much as we can in terms of events with the charter. We can see from, you know, me interacting with Brandon in the last week that he's open to, you know, adding these new pieces in as they appear. But I think we definitely need to put some emphasis on how do we deal with the unknown, how in terms of practicality, how can we deal with the unknown? So what I'm going to commit to doing is trying to see if we can get Brandon on next week, maybe for the whole hour. We could maybe dedicate at least half of the session to talking about these things. I know we're going to go off onto another topic now, which is actually another thing that I think Brandon would have some great insight to. So before we do, though, does anybody else want to bring anything up around this topic? If you're in the chat, we can bring you up on the stage if you want to add anything to the conversation. Okay, well, we can move on to the other topic. So this is a topic that Chris suggested, and I think it's a real interesting one, and definitely plays into what we've already discussed. And it's basically having a discussion around the incentives in the network as they stand today, and where they're going in the future. So just to sort of outline the situation, or what we want to have a discussion about, I'll just read out what I put down on paper here. It's just a short paragraph. Indexer rewards, that is rewards from staking, hugely outweigh query fee rebates. And this is likely to be the case for the foreseeable future as the query business grows on the mainnet. This causes an imbalance in the network incentives. For example, profit maximalist indexers might choose to just optimize for maximum indexer rewards and ignore the signal. This potentially could have a negative impact on the serving of queries. What sort of effects does that have on the network, and what other imbalances does low relative query fee rebates cause in the long term? So Chris, do you want to maybe elaborate on your thoughts on this area, and then we'll maybe see if anyone else wants to talk about this?
Sure. I wish I'd kind of prepared more thoroughly for this. And just by the way, Be Like Water in the non-stage put their hand up to speak. In short, I think a lot of the game theory in the network economics depends upon market intelligence. And I think a lot of market intelligence is wrapped into query fees as opposed to indexing rewards. And because the incentives are so dominated by indexing rewards today, the way in which the actors in the network are incentivized is very naive. So for example, as Jim alluded to, as an indexer, I'm incentivized really to just maximize my indexing rewards if I'm a profit maximalist. And that, will probably mean that I am averse to indexing subgraphs that are difficult to index, right? That may be heavy to index computationally or have trace requirements. I may be hesitant to index subgraphs that have any kind of heightened failure risk. I don't want to call out anyone specifically, but obviously if a subgraph experiences a high rate of churn or the underlying protocol does, then there's a much higher chance of it failing. The query fee market should price that in and should provide sufficient incentives for indexes to index and serve that data anyway. But in the absence of strong query fee revenues, those incentives just don't exist. And it creates an environment where indexes are incentivized not really to, not perform their duties in exactly the way that the network assumes that they might in the presence of strong query fees. Because those many aspects of market intelligence and kind of the market setting the price for those queries is just completely absent. And instead we just have, dumb, naive indexing rewards.
And there's also the fact that the slashing risks are not well defined, and you don't know what you're getting yourself into by serving queries.
Yeah, so I guess the question really becomes, is there going to be a sort of inflection point where the query fees look to be high enough that they start to entice the indexers into indexing them and serving the queries? I guess we're trying to outplot the unknown here, right? But I think it's worth considering how do we get from where we are today, where everyone's sort of aligned towards indexing rewards, towards a world where we're more aligned towards query rewards.
I believe for the query fees to match the indexing rewards from inflation at the price suggested by the team, there would be a need for 5.5 trillion queries per month, I believe, if I recall correctly. And yeah, that's quite far away from where we stand now.
Yeah, I mean, where is it compared to where we stand now, right? We're 20% month on month, roughly speaking, I believe, right? On hosted,
yes.
anyway.
Yes.
So we can expect it to be a slower growth pattern for the midterm, right on mainnet as things move over. When I think about when the dynamics might start changing, I guess it's when the first really popular, like mega popular, big DeFi subgraph moves over, something with big traffic.
Something with swap at the end of the name, yeah.
Yeah, quite possibly, yeah.
But yeah, even then, it needs the whole crypto space to grow. But yeah, I mean, it's growing. It's growing faster than anything else on the planet, technologically speaking. So yeah.
I think that the major driver of query fees will likely be the sunsetting of the hosted service. I mean, there's already incredibly strong demand for queries, which is exemplified by the hosted service, but there's very little incentive to adopt the decentralized network while you can have queries for free.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I was also thinking about that. Plus the limitations of the hosted service, like being a single point of failure, and the fact that it goes down from time to time. Also, like when this gets sunset, people are well incentivized by the nature of the decentralized protocol to move over, because it gives you a lot of flexibility, and it's more reliable, and it's a natural load balance environment, and yeah, you don't need to think about anything else. It just runs.
Yeah, even those features, in the early sort of inception stage worry me. When I think about moving to mainnet from a sort of an enterprise service, IT service management point of view, how do you manage a service that is decentralized, right? That's the core question for me. And it plays into this idea of the network incentives not being right, potentially not being right. If the network incentives aren't correct and we aren't maximizing the number of indexers on an important subgraph, so Uniswap, we'll use the example again, then the enterprise service management stuff comes to the forefront. And what happens if there's only 5 indexers providing the service to Uniswap? That's just not a situation that we want to be in, right? We want to be in a situation where we're maximally decentralized in terms of number of indexers providing the service to Uniswap. What if we end up in a situation where we're not? I think that's the type of problem that this incentive alignment question really getting to, right?
I think it is also just a path that we need to follow. We obviously can't transition the majority of that query volume until we're sure that the decentralized network can serve that demand. So we kind of just have to ride through it. I think another thing that's important though is the hosted service and the decentralized network do not have feature parity. And particularly when you're talking about, a Uniswap v3 subgraph or something that's really heavy and processing enormous amounts of transactions relative to, block space, features like subgraph grafting and having a more mature pipeline for developers to roll out changes and have those changes propagate in a predictable way through the decentralized network so that there's sufficient capacity to serve demand is really important. And I don't think that the answers to those questions are clear at all yet. And I think they will need to be before the decentralized network is ready for prime time.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. And I know that there's a lot of things going on in the sort of gearing up things on the Edge and Node side in terms of product managers and that sort of thing. So Martin, are you there? Are you able to speak on, are some of these problems becoming the focus of, product managers at Edge and Node? I'm hoping Martin's there. Maybe if not, maybe Eva or Ford can talk on that. If at all, it would be really useful if you could.
Reem is here too.
Hey, Martin.
Hey, sorry, jumping with my microphone. Yeah, definitely this is the topic of focus of several product managers and Brandon included. But I don't have any specific details to share. Sorry, I can help a lot there.
That's okay. I mean, it's happening, right?
Yeah, I can invite Brandon. Yeah, definitely it's happening, and it's the topic internally. Internally, between the PMs, but
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was my last topic. Does anybody want to add anything to that discussion? Or does anyone have anything else they'd like to discuss or ask? Feel free to ask in the office hours chat if you have a question as well. Well, Ford is typing. Let's give Ford a second. Oh, cool. So Ford's in the meeting right now talking about the exact sort of stuff we're talking about. So it's the top of his mind. That's great. Thanks, Ford. Okay, so if there's nothing else anybody wants to bring up, then we'll take 10 minutes back instead of going over, which we seem to do most times. Great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining in Office Hours number 15. We'll see you next week.